Let's move on to CSS units. Units determine the size of everything in your page. Today we're going to cover the most common CSS units. On the left I have Visual Studio Code. On the right I have the Chrome browser. It has an H1 heading on the page, and we have one paragraph on our page. And we're displaying this page with the live server extension, so anytime we make a change and save our CSS file, we'll automatically see the changes over here on the page. I'm going to start out by just putting in a paragraph selector, and then I'm going to put in the font size. And after that, without even typing anything, look what Visual Studio Code gives us. A lot of suggestions. There are so many different units we could choose from. So today we'll cover only the most popular ones, as we don't need to cover all of them, just the ones that you'll see and construct your pages with most frequently. So I'm not even going to put in a definition right now. Let's just delete that and switch over to the MDN page for values and units. And we can see a chart here of absolute length units. And really the only absolute length unit we will use commonly is pixels. And you can see here is the equivalency. It's 1 pixel is equal to 1/96th of an inch. And really 1 pixel, as you might guess, means 1 pixel on your screen. We abbreviate that with px. And I say it's the only absolute value we're going to cover because, as MDN says, it's really the only value that you will commonly use as far as absolute units go. So let's switch back to our page. And now here in our CSS page, I'll once again select the paragraph, and we can set a absolute size to the font in our paragraph if we want to. The default in any browser is usually 16. So if I set it to 16, we don't see a change. But if I set it to 32, we definitely see a change. It gets twice as big. But I don't usually want to use an absolute value like pixels for a font size. And let me show you why. Normally, we have a default browser size. As I mentioned, that's usually 16 pixels. However, if I set that on the root element, font size, 16 pixels, we don't see a change here. But if I go into my settings in Chrome, which you can do with the 3 dots and then choose settings, once you launch that, you'll be on a settings page, and then you can choose appearance. You go to a font size user preference, and medium is what most are on, but there's also other choices from very small to very large. I'll choose very large. We definitely see a change on the settings page right when I do that. Back in our document, we don't see a change. It didn't change at all. I can refresh and it won't make any difference. It did not change our font size with the user settings, and that's because we took that choice away when we said, no, these absolutely must be 16 pixels here. That's our root size. But if I delete this and we just let the browser handle the default size, instantly all of our font gets bigger and our user settings take over. We don't want to take that choice away from the users, so we don't want to use an absolute font size such as a pixel setting. So I'll go ahead and delete that. So where would we want to use pixels, an absolute value? There are other settings that we might want an absolute value for. So I'll select the H1 that I have here, and I'm going to set a border on it, and I'll set it to 2 pixels. And then just so we can see it better, I'll set it to dashed and red so it really stands out, and save. And now we can see this border around our H1 element, and we have this absolute value for the pixel width. And no matter what happens to the page, on a small viewport, large viewport, whether it's a mobile device or a large desktop screen, this will remain as 2 pixels, and that's okay in this instance. Let's go back to our MDN page. And now that we've covered the only pixel size that we were going to cover, and that was down here on our pixel chart, we're going to now cover percentage. And we see that up here in a different chart. This is a numbers, lengths, and percentages chart here. So we're going to use percentage, and it says it represents a fraction of some other value. So 50% of something else. Percentages are always relative to another quantity. So that's a consideration as well. Now, when we set percentages, we wouldn't normally do that with a font size either. So let's set a percentage for a width on our H1. And now by default, an H1 is a block level element. And so by default, it has a width of 100%. So if we do that, We're not really changing anything, and now it's just 100% as expected. So let's go ahead and change that. It looks at the parent though. It's taking up 100% of the parent's width, or whatever was given to it. So whatever it has available to it, it took up 100%. And now this is only taking up 50%. So let's look at the parent for the H1. It is inside of a header element. So if we take this header element and we set it to a width of 50%, then we should see a difference. And yes, it's even smaller. So we're taking up only 50% of the header element, which is taking up 50% of the page. So really this H1 would be 25% of the page. Likewise, if we change this to 100 for the header, then we'll see our H1 takes up 50% of the page. So that's this thing to remember about setting a percentage for the width, is that you are putting it relative to the parent. It's only using what it has available to it. If the header is 100%, then the H1, that is the child, has 100% of the page available to it. However, if the header is smaller, let's put it at 80%, then we're only using up 50% of 80% of the page. And once again, if you want an element that is a block level element to take up 100% of the width of the page, you don't really need to set it, because that is the default value already. So now we're taking up half of the page by setting the H1 to 50%, because it is 50% of the full 100% width. And you may see other uses for percentages as well, but you commonly see them to set the sizing of different elements as far as the width of the page, or sometimes the height. But also we don't need to set the height because it will grow as the content grows. I'm going to go back to my settings and set it from very large back to medium, which is where most have their browser default to. And now when we look at our page, the font is smaller, but let's talk about another relative unit. And this one does show on the MDN page in the chart down here under relative length units, and it's the rem. This is the unit that we'll typically use for font size, and it relates to the font size of the root element. Now, I already suggested we shouldn't set a font size on the root element. So for our HTML element, we typically wouldn't set a font size in here because we want to let the browser handle that and set the default font size. So let's not do this for the HTML element. I'll just go ahead and cut this. I'm going to put it below the H1, and I'm going to set a font size for our paragraphs instead. And this font size, if we set it to 1 rem, that's already the default, so it shouldn't change anything, and we see the size is the same. So it says 1 root element, which the root element is the default font size set by the browser. The EM doesn't stand for element, by the way, that's M, so we have 1 root EM or 1 root M, but that means the root size that is defined, and in our case, when we don't set it, then it's set by the browser. So hopefully that clears up some confusion. But if we put in 2 M's, then it's going to double the default size, and now we're probably at 36 pixels right here because most browsers default to that 16 pixel size. So you can see how this relates back to the root. Now if we set a font size on the parent, because our paragraph is in a main element, we set this font size to 2 rem also, it doesn't change the paragraph font size at all because the font set here is not relative to the main element. It's not relative to the parent, it's relative to the root, which is defined by the browser. So it's always going to look back to that default root size. If we had set a font size in the HTML element, it would be looking at that. But without setting it, it's the default size. So what happens though if we switch these units? If we're not using rem, if we're using M, just EM. So now I'll delete the R there and save. Oh boy, that got a lot bigger. Well, here's the problem that we would have if we were using M's for our font size. It gets amplified. So our main element was looking at the root, so it doubled that to 32 pixels, and then using 2 M's is looking at the main element, which is the parent of the paragraph, and so then it doubled that. So now we're at 64 pixels. So that's what happens, and you can get unintended consequences if you just use ems, and that's why using the rem and always looking at the root definitely helps, because the way we can get confused, for example, is if I remove this setting on the main and I save, well, now this is also looking at the root because there's no other font size saved, and so we think, okay, we're good to use just ems, but the problem is if somewhere along the way in our project, and we have many elements we're styling, we set another font size on a parent element, suddenly it's amplified when we use ems. So I'm going to switch this back to 2 rems and get closer to the size we'd want, and it's going to look at the root. So when would we use ems instead of rems? We know we want to use rems on font size. Well, when we set the font size on an element, em doesn't look at the parent, it looks at the element itself. And so we could use it for something like margin or padding, which I know we haven't covered and we will in more detail when we look at the CSS box model. But I'm going to go ahead and do that here for the H1. So if I set a font size for the H1, and let's make it bigger, let's make it 3 rem here, and we save, we instantly have a bigger font size on the H1. But now I could set the padding to 1em, which is the equivalent of the font size of that element. So now this would also be 3 rems. So it should be a pretty good size padding. Yes, we have a lot of padding, so I probably don't want that much. Maybe I want to drop it to 0.5. And now that's more reasonable. That looks pretty good for a heading there. So we added that padding, which is inside this border. It added extra padding, and that is essentially half of 3 rems, which would be 1.5. And if we relate all this back to the default 16 pixel size, 1.5 of those would be 24 pixels, whereas 3 rems would be 48 pixels. Another instance where we may use ems instead of rems would be for the padding or margin setting on, say, a button. If we created a button, we would have text in the button. We could set the font size for that button with rem, but then we could go ahead and set the padding and or margin with the M units. Let's go back to the MDN page and look at our chart. One other relative unit I'd like to look at today is the CH. That stands for character, and we have the advanced measure width of the glyph 0, which essentially means the character 0 of the element's font. So whatever font we're using, it's the measurement of 0, and that helps us determine the character width. And that kind of comes from print, magazine, newspaper layout, and those sort of things where you only want to have a certain width based on the character size. So in this example, we have a font size here for our paragraph. I'm going to go ahead and set the width of the paragraph, and let's say we don't want any more than an estimated 40 characters per line before the line wraps in the paragraph. If we set that width, notice it now has approximately 40 characters before the line wraps, and that kind of helps us define columns if we're doing that in some type of layout. Now, we've acknowledged that the browser sets a default font size, but it actually sets a lot of different default styles as well. So let's go ahead and right-click on this H1 heading and choose Inspect, or you could press Control, Shift, and the letter I. Either way, what we're doing is opening up the DevTools. It may scrunch our page here a little bit, but that's okay. If I highlight this H1, now it is showing several things about the page. It's showing that there's a large margin. That's going to be the orange when I highlight over. It's showing the green area, and that's padding that we set. And then the blue area is the H1 itself right here. So we see all of those things in DevTools when we hover over these elements. And by the way, I'm on the Elements tab of DevTools. And then if you don't have your DevTools on the right, you can click the 3 dots here, and there's a dock side setting. Maybe it's on the bottom for you, but if you want it on the right, you can choose dock to the right just like I have here. So we can really see more about all of these elements in DevTools. What we can also see as we come down here are the styles, And then we see the H1 and the styles that I have set on the H1 element. But underneath that, we see some others as well. And it says User Agent Style Sheet. This is what the browser is setting on the H1 element by default that we don't have to. And you can see we have put in a different font size. So we have overridden the font size for the H1 element. So it has crossed that out. Everything else here, the display block and the different margins and even the font weight, are applied from that user style sheet. So those are default styles, and we can override them just like I did with the font size. And before we get into these next two relative units, we are going to override some of these. So what I want to do is start a CSS reset, which I'll talk about more in the tutorial of the CSS box model as well. But I'm going to use the selector that selects all elements again, our wildcard selector. And here I'm going to set the margin to 0, the padding to 0, and one other setting that says box sizing, and I'm going to set that to border box. And when I save, notice all the padding and margin is gone. Now our H1 is right up in the left corner. We don't have any space between the paragraph and the H1. We got rid of all of those default margins and paddings that were creating that extra space. But that's important when we go back to the MDN page and we look at these next two relative units. We have viewport width, which is 1% of the viewport's width, and viewport height, which is 1% of the viewport's height. So let's look at how we could apply those. But if we had that extra margin and padding there, we wouldn't be able to see the detail that I want to show. Okay, I'm going to take our main element here and set a width on it with our viewport width units, just so we can see what it is capable of. And so I'll do that. I also need to set a background color just so we can see what we're doing better. And I'll set this to, let's say, sky blue, and save. So now we can see the width of our paragraph is actually wider than the width of our main element. And so it is overflowing that main element. But we've actually set the main element to 50% of the width of the full page. And you can see that's matching the 50% width that we have up here. But I'm using the viewport width units right here. There may be times when you want to use the viewport width, but most of the time I find myself using the percentage and getting the same result. And I'll give an example where the percentage is actually a better choice. So let me remove that 50%, and I'll remove this background color that's making our page look bad. And we'll come back up to the top, and underneath our select all, I'm going to choose the body element here. And as I'd said before, we don't need to set a width of 100%, but I'll put this in, and I'm going to set this to 100 viewport width units instead, and save. Now we don't really notice a change. And I have seen this on pages, and I've even done it myself, but I figured out the problem. If we have a width of 100 viewport width units, we do have a problem when the content the vertical content outgrows the page, and I'll show you why. So I need to go back to the HTML, and in the HTML I'm going to quickly add some more content. So I'll say paragraph times 10, and we'll do this with some just sample lorem text. That's an Emmet abbreviation. So when I press tab, it adds all those extra paragraphs, and save. Now we've got lots of content here. And now we have a problem. And here's the problem. Our scroll bar showed up on the right, which is good. We need that to see all of this content. But what also happened is we had a scroll bar show up down here on the bottom. And that is because our viewport width, when we set it to 100, as we did on the body right here, does not account for this scroll bar on the right. So as soon as this scroll bar on the right shows up, and it shows up when our content outgrows our height, so when we need to scroll to see the content is when this shows up, as it should, but then that little extra bit that we can't see creates this scroll bar so we can see it. And that's annoying, and most developers don't like that horizontal scroll bar showing up. So if you were to set the width, 100% would be much more desirable, because now we still get the scroll bar here where we can scroll up and down vertically. We do not have a scroll bar on the bottom, and we don't usually want that. But overall, as I'd mentioned before, we don't even need to set 100% width on the body, as it should default to that anyway. I'm going to jump back to the HTML and go ahead and undo all of that extra content we added and save. So we're back to our normal content for the page. Let's go back to style as well. And let's right click once again on the page, and I think I selected the paragraph here, so when DevTools opens up, it should be on the paragraph, and we'll see that here in just a second. Yep, I'm on the paragraph. Now let's highlight the body. Notice the body is not the full height of the page. It only grows with the content. But sometimes we want a body element that is the full height of the page, even if we don't have enough content to do that. And we can do that with the viewport height unit. And I'm going to do that over here in our code. I'll choose the body element, but I don't want to set height because that would also limit it to 100 VH, and then we could outgrow that if our content were to outgrow. What I want to do is set the min height to 100 VH and save, and now that will still allow the body to grow with the content if it outgrows the viewport, but at the same time, it's now the full page. And there could be instances where you want that.